I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Horror stories that take place at home are some of the most terrifying stories out there. The idea that someone or something could infiltrate what we call home is scary just to think about. In today's video, I will be covering 4 stories detailing just that. The last story is a bonus story that won't be following the theme, but it was a well-written and fun story to read that I figured I'd add on to the video anyways. A huge thank you to the writers. Remember, you can send stories to rylhstories@gmail.com. If you enjoy the video, likes and comments are always appreciated. Subscribing if you're new is as well. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. Okay, so where to begin? I live in this tiny 8-room apartment building. It used to be an old motel, but was remodeled a couple decades ago. Although I've only been living here for the past year. After a few months here, I noticed that there was a pair of extra doors on the end of the building. That wasn't an actual numbered room. I figured it must be the maintenance access to underneath, where the utilities are. Or maybe just a storage closet. Curiosity had always gotten me into trouble, and I've always wanted to explore abandoned buildings. But I didn't want to get into trouble, or perhaps be charged with trespassing. Then about a week ago, I get a letter in the mail saying the building is being torn down, and everyone's leases are being terminated. So yesterday I built up the courage and figured since the place is being torn down, who cares? I grabbed a flashlight and headed out. I tried the doorknob on the door next to my own apartment. It turned. I quickly entered and shut the door behind me, hoping no one saw me sneak in. I was standing at the top of the small staircase that led down underneath everybody's rooms. But then off to the right of the staircase was a small hallway that led to a room where that second unused door was. I decided to peek downstairs first, and took a quick glance around the corner. My assumptions were correct. Just a hot water tank, and a few other utilities around a sparse-looking basement. I headed back upstairs and tried to peek into that room with the other door, but it looked like someone had put an unused screen door and mattress in the hallway, making only about a foot or two gap through. Not one to give up now. I slowly squeezed my way through the hallway. I barely fit past the mattress and briefly hoped it would be easier to get back out. Then I panned my flashlight around what I guess used to be the old office and front desk used to check in. As I looked around, I saw yet another hallway in the back corner of the room. It looked like that was the hallway where guests would walk down to their rooms after checking in at the front desk. But everyone's door is on the outside of the building now. I started to wonder if maybe all the doorways had been boarded up, and there was just an empty hallway behind. Then I heard something drop from down the hallway. Trying not to immediately freak out and run off, I told myself it must have been a rat or something, and started to wonder if there was an unused room down the hallway. Before I could even consider maybe walking down there, I heard a male voice start to whistle. His whistle was too loud and unmuffled. Not caring if anyone outside saw me trespassing at this point, I turned around and fiddled with the deadbolt and the doorknob, but couldn't figure out in my own setting panic which one of the 2 locks was actually keeping it shut, and keeping me trapped inside. I turned my head back to the hallway, and my blood ran cold as I froze in place. There was a scruffy looking guy peeking around a corner at the end of the hallway. I started to shake and I wanted to scream, but I just stood there, staring into his cold, dead eyes. They looked like they were glossed over. Like he wasn't even looking at me, but off into the distance. I don't know how much time passed before one of us decided to make a move. Unfortunately, it was him. He started to move out into the hallway, and that's when my functions returned. I slammed myself back through the hallway with the mattress and door, not caring how loud I was, or if anyone heard me. Then I threw open the door and ran back to my own apartment. After closing and locking my own door, I picked up a knife from the kitchen counter. I turned back and just stared at my front door, waiting. After a few minutes and a couple deep breaths, I decided to call the police. I didn't care if I was trespassing. I didn't care if I was charged. I didn't feel safe anymore knowing someone was between the walls of the apartment. One officer stayed with me, as the other entered and began his search. After a couple minutes, he radios back and calls for a medical team. An ambulance shows up and the paramedics are soon bringing out a guy on a stretcher. The same scruffy guy I saw. He's dead. The cops take my statement and search the empty rooms for any evidence. I'm not sure what they found, but what the paramedics said still haunts me as I sit here. listening to the sounds come from the other side of my wall. He's been dead for a couple of days. When I was 11 going on 12, we made our third move in 9 months. Like many families, we needed to find a place to live before the start of the school year, and thus went on the dreaded house hunt. I swear that entire summer was spent in the company of our realtors Mark and Jane, driving throughout the city from house to house. Mark made such silly jokes that they went past funny and into annoying, and Jane mostly answered our questions and had sympathy for us. I was sick and tired of all the moves, ripping my life apart for my father's selfish end goal of being a big man in business. There was plenty of arguments night after night about my attitude and how I should keep it all together. Terrified of the consequences, I kept my tongue to myself. One blazing hot July Sunday morning, we returned to our temporary apartment after attending church, and we had a missed call from Mark. There was a house that had finally become available. "It'd be great for everyone," Mark said, speaking fast. "It went through a vast remodeling, has the 4 bedrooms and 3 bathrooms you've wanted. It's just a 5-minute drive from the school you've picked for the kids. It's in a neighborhood with rising market value, and it's got both a pool and a big yard." Of course, the news of the pool got my attention right away, and I was smiling as we drove to the address Mark and Jane gave us, not even having time to change out of our church clothes. Mark and Jane met us at the front of the house, and it was just as described. It was a 2-story house of gray and white stone, with rose bushes in the front and sprawling grounds. Granted, it looked like something from the 80s, but that was something we could live with. Mark was grinning, but Jane was subdued and quiet. We thought nothing of it and went inside. We had to cross the living room to explore the rest of the house, but stayed in the doorway. Ever seen a movie where the music fades to high-pitched strings, and the camera tilts into a Dutch angle to convey unease? That feeling overwhelmed me. "That's silly," I tried to reassure myself. "There's no monsters here." Dad turned back to me. "Hey Gracie, you better hurry," he said. I swallowed and crossed the threshold, my feet dragged across the brand new white carpet. The strange feeling subsided, and I picked up the pace. That's when I felt it, a harsh stabbing pain in my stomach, like someone kicking me over and over. I turned and ran outside, throwing up what was left of my breakfast on the fresh, clean driveway. My knees knocked and sweat pooled on my face. Mom rushed outside asking me what was wrong. I couldn't articulate what it was, only that I didn't feel good. She stayed outside with me, fuming that she wasn't looking at the house along with Mark, Jane, Dad, and my brother. I wanted to get the courage to go back in the house and go along with it, if only for Mom's sake, but my legs couldn't move. Everyone else came out and Mark asked us what we thought. My brother said, "The pool is so cool, and there's a playhouse for us." My mom, still upset that I was being a drama queen, said, "I did like what I could see from the kitchen." I said nothing, still remembering that odd sensation and the stomach pain. Dad nodded and said, "I think we might make an offer on the place." That's when I spoke up. "There's something wrong with the house. I don't like it." Dad looked at me, rolling his eyes. "You weren't anywhere but the living room. How can you be sure if you don't try?" I raised my voice. "I won't go anywhere near that house. I don't care where I live, but I'm not living here." With a voice that promised I would get grounded for at least a month, Dad looked at Mark and Jane and shook their hands. "Thank you for your time. My wife and I will contact you both tomorrow." We went back to the apartment and I sat silently in the car, dreading the day I'd have to experience what happened in the house all over again. The next day, my brother and I went to the apartment pool to swim, while our parents talked to Mark and Jane about the property. When we came back that evening, my now somber mom patted me on the shoulder and said, "It's okay, Gracie. You're not in trouble, and we're not getting the house." Stunned, I looked at her and asked why when they were so happy about it. She smiled and said, "It's okay. You don't need to worry about it." 2 weeks later, we found a new house and settled, and I forgot about the house entirely until a few weeks ago. Mom, my brother, and I were having drinks and talking about the summer when I decided to finally ask her, "Hey Mom, remember the house we toured when I got sick and refused to look through the rest of the place?" My mom nodded. "Yeah, what about it, Grace? You and Dad were so excited to get the place, and then changed your minds about it the next day. What happened?" Mom took a deep breath and said, "Yeah, I think you two are old enough to know." When Mark and Jane came over with the paperwork for the offer, they asked if my parents had any questions. Mom, who still remembered how sick and scared I was, decided to ask, "Is there anything about the house we should be made aware of? By law, you're required to." Jane took a deep breath. "There was a murder in the house about 20 years ago," she said. It turned out the last owner of the house learned that his business was going under, and that his wife was having an affair behind his back with a business partner. In a ploy to get revenge and the insurance money, he attacked her when she came home, and tried to make it look like a robbery gone wrong. However, he was caught, sentenced to death, and was executed a year or so before we looked at the house. The house had sat empty for years, and nobody wanted to buy it. The man who inherited the property decided to go through an extensive remodeling to ensure the house would sell. We were the first to see the remodel, and the first to reject it after that. Eventually the man tore down the house entirely, and finally sold the property for new owners to do with as they will. My stomach turned in a knot, and the old stabbing pain came back. How did the wife die? Mom swallowed hard. She was stabbed in the stomach. As a middle-aged, middle-income office worker who never left his small middle American hometown, it's common for me to find myself wanting more. More money, more excitement, more respect. Just more rather than middle. When I first heard about lucid dreaming, I thought I'd struck gold. On-demand fulfillment of my every fantasy. In a universe where I have total control, sign me up. After reading a few lucid dreaming blogs and watching some YouTube videos, I considered myself an expert on the topic, and decided to attempt the WILD method. For those of you who are unfamiliar with lucid dreaming, WILD stands for Wake-Induced Lucid Dreaming. The method boils down to convincing your mind that your body is asleep, generally by sleeping on your back, and visualizing your ideal dream scene, which forces your body into sleep paralysis, and sends you into a dream state even though you're fully aware of your surroundings. So I set an alarm for 3 AM, and when I woke up, I reassured myself of actually being awake, and laid still on my back. For my first dream setting, I decided to visualize my bedroom during the daytime. This was a horrible mistake. You don't want to conjure up a dream environment where you can easily perform reality checks, somewhere that bears as little resemblance as possible to your everyday life. Sure enough, after what felt like 5 minutes, I woke up to sunlight pouring through my window and birds chirping outside. I'd failed and actually fell asleep. With a defeated sigh, I checked my phone. 7:30 AM, 0 notifications. Yep, I'm not dreaming. And I'm about to be late for work. Maybe I'll try again tonight. I took a shower, and as I was brushing my teeth, I noticed something strange in the bathroom mirror. The man staring back at me was the exact same man I saw every morning. But when I looked at him, I felt envy. The longer I looked, the more envious I felt, though why I felt this way is inexplicable. He looked the same, bearing the trademark paunch common to most men approaching their mid-40s, and dressed the same, wearing an on-iron baby blue button-down shirt that was too tight around the midsection and too loose around the shoulders. I swear he was smirking, which transformed my envy into a potent rage, causing me to hurtle my right fist toward the mirror. Just as my fist was about to strike his face, I realized how ridiculous I must have looked. Fighting my own reflection and breaking a mirror I could barely afford to replace this month. But as my knuckles made contact with the mirror surface, everything from my hand up to my wrist entered the mirror, obscuring my reflection's face. By this point, I had completely forgotten about my intention to lucid dream, meaning I missed the obvious explanation to why I had just punched myself through solid glass, as though it were water. Everything on the other side felt exactly the same, neither hot nor cold, and I could open and close my hand freely. Suddenly I felt a steady tug on my right arm. Initially it seemed like a playful gesture, and I reciprocated by lightly tugging back. The next tug was more forceful, so I pulled harder to let my mirror buddy know that I don't want to play anymore. The third and final tug became a powerful jerk, and my entire body flew through the mirror. I was still in my bathroom, but my hand was no longer in the mirror. Instead, I had punched and shattered the undoubtedly solid glass. My reflection now bore an unmistakable smile. He waved, turned around and calmly exited the bathroom, leaving me to stare at nothing. My reflection is missing from all other mirrors in my house. I'm missing from all the photos around my house. And when I point my phone camera at myself, I see nothing. I've performed every reality check I can think of, checking the time, counting my fingers, reciting the alphabet, and so on. But everything checks out, and I'm convinced that I'm no longer dreaming. To the displeasure of my boss, I even called in sick to work, so I can process what just happened and type out this cry for help. Back when I was in 4th grade, I was friends with this super clean cut kid who always tucked in his collared shirt into his khakis. He was brought up religious while my family wasn't, and we had this running game where we both tried to come up with questions to trip the other up. I remember one time sitting on my couch playing video games when I told him everything could be measured, and his counter was to ask how I could measure the distance between heaven and hell. I was completely stumped, but I knew my dad would know because he knew everything. We ran to ask him in our dreadfully white kitchen, where he spent most of his time because it was the room with the best light. He put down the book he was reading real slow, looked at me over his glasses, then at my friend, then back at me before finally saying, "A second is more than enough time to get there, if that second is bad enough." That answer always stuck with me. It came back years later when I was a sophomore in high school, and the vice principal peeked into my English class to call my name in a low, hushed voice. I thought I was getting in trouble for something until I got into the hall, and she handed me a cell phone, from which an excessively calm voice told me that my father had suffered a massive heart attack, and had passed before he even got to the hospital. I remember thanking the faceless voice for telling me, and hanging up. After the call, I looked down at the phone screen, and noticed that the call lasted 10 minutes and 23 seconds, from the time the vice principal first picked up, and I wondered which of those was the one where I made the journey. The best man I'd ever known died, and he was only 42 years old, and anyone who has lost the one they admire most knows how it feels for part of themselves to die with them. It didn't occur to me that my second between heaven and hell hadn't happened yet though, and that it wouldn't happen until a night in college when I discovered the secret door in my house. It was an old Victorian style house that looked more like a bunch of smaller houses had randomly smashed together than any deliberate construction. There was a group of 8 of us who pulled together to rent the place, which ended up being way cheaper than individual dorm rooms. Even after we'd been there for a few months, we kept discovering new things about the place, like a fireplace that had been boarded up, or the dumb waiter chute hidden in what we thought was an electrical box. Well, one night 5 of us were hanging out in the living room when Derek, engineering major with a mouth that never seemed to fully close, showed us this trick he learned. He put a layer of clear tape over the phone's flashlight and colored it blue with a marker, then another layer colored pink, and a few more going back and forth like that. When he was done, he turned on the light, which was now filtered into UVA and worked like a black light. We had all been drinking a bit by this point and laughed enormously at all the gross glowing splotches on the couch. We turned out the rest of the lights to make the colors pop and took turns shining the light on our teeth to make them glow. Then we chased around Chrissy, the only girl in our group, whose makeup reacted to make her look like some sort of demonic clown. She was less amused, and probably less drunk, than the rest of us, so she took off up the stairs while we all followed. Gregory had a perfect Australian accent, and he made the Steve Irwin voice, like we were stalking some exotic beast that we didn't want to frighten off. It was all in good fun, but Chrissy was in no mood and she locked herself in her room. The slamming of her door cut through our buzz a bit, and we all felt like jerks, and the game didn't seem so fun anymore. It was during this moment of sudden quiet that the light fell on a blank patch of wall, and the outline of a door suddenly glowed from nowhere. Derek, Gregory, a third guy named Preston, and me, all staring at it in silence, like we'd just been visited by a UFO. "Dude," Preston said. "Dude?" The rest of us replied in a solemn chorus, the only appropriate response in such circumstances. Derek ran his hands over the outline. It quickly became apparent that the light was shining through the wallpaper. As you can imagine, with 4 buzzed college boys, We respected the property and wouldn't dream of tearing off the wallpaper on a rental just to satisfy an idle curiosity. At least for a few seconds anyway. Derek had a pocket knife on his keychain, and he slid it into the wall to trace the outline of the door, which was positioned almost exactly between his room and Chrissy's on the other side. It didn't seem like there was enough space for a third hidden room between them. And consensus said it couldn't have been larger than a closet that had been sealed up. We peeled back the wallpaper to reveal a solid wooden door that matched the design of the rest of the house. But it wasn't the door that was glowing. There was a thin gap around the edges, and whatever the UV light was reacting with was coming from behind. "What if it opens into Chrissy's room?" Gregory asked. "She would literally kill us if we all just tumbled through." "Don't worry about it," Preston said. "We'll just tell her it was your idea, and that we were trying to stop you." He pushed against the door and it gave a little, seeming more stuck than locked. "Chrissy, you'll want to come see this," Gregory called through the wall. "We promise not to shine the light on you." The language in her reply would have been sufficient to embarrass a career criminal, and doesn't need to be replicated here. It was too late anyway, because Derek had put his shoulder to the door and had already forced it open. "Whoa, it's bigger in here than I thought," he said. "Brighter too." The harsh light was reflecting from a room painted entirely in white, from the cabinets to the white counter, to the white tiles on the floor, even the furniture, a familiar set of white wooden table and chairs. "Why would they want an extra kitchen upstairs?" Preston asked. "Duh, for the servants," Gregory said, moving down the line of cabinets to open and close each one. "Hey, there's food in here. Cereal and rice and crap. Cheerios and Frosted Flakes." I already knew that without looking. "Servants don't need their own kitchen, idiots," Derek replied. "Rich people with servants don't even go in the kitchen. You're going to suck at being rich, as much as you suck at being poor now." "Dang, dude, that cuts deep," Gregory said. "The fridge is working too, and this food looks really fresh." I reached through the darkness on my right and flipped on the light switch, exactly where I knew it would be. How could I fail to recognize the exact kitchen in the house I grew up in? Everything from the design of the room to the same brand of microwave and same blue curtains with white clouds hanging on the opposite end of the room. The only difference was that the windows were all walled up now. Every detail the same, family pictures hanging on the wall, fresh tomatoes on the counter from my mother's garden. And yes, as hesitant as I am to say it out loud, for the pure absurdity it sounds, even to me, there was my father sitting at the kitchen table, with a closed book in his hands. My friends all flinched from the light of my flip switch, their sudden unease apparent. "How could the food be fresh?" Derek asked quietly. "We've been here for months, and it must have been sealed up for longer than that." "You don't think someone has been living here, do you?" Preston asked, taking a hesitant shuffle back toward the door. "No way," Derek said. "I don't even know how there's space for a room here. There definitely couldn't be anywhere else where he's hiding." I don't know what bothered me more, that I was seeing my father again for the first time since his death, or that my friends obviously couldn't see what I sensed directly before me. My dad was staring right at me, looking at me the way I remember him in my most nostalgic childhood memories. Strong and healthy, with straight brown hair without a hint of gray. Keen, stern eyes over the rim of his glasses were locked on my own. "There had to have been someone," Gregory said, agreeing with Preston and backing toward the door. "There's still dishes in the sink, and they aren't even moldy or anything. Let's get out of here." "Yeah, I bet the landlord lives here. I bet he's still been living in the house to keep an eye on us, and we hadn't noticed. This place is big enough, and he could have just been using the back door and not leaving his room." "I knew he seemed suspicious, even after we paid the security deposit," Derek said. "We're probably in his kitchen right now." By this point, all three of them had crowded back to the door. I still hadn't broken eye contact with my father, who was now smirking softly. I felt helpless to blink, let alone follow my friends. "Hurry up, man," Gregory called to me. "If he catches us here, he's going to be pissed. We can just use Derek's clear tape to put the wallpaper back up, and he will never know. You should go with them," my father said, his voice as thoughtful and measured as it always had been. You wouldn't want to be caught somewhere you don't belong. I'm going to stay, I said to my friends, my back still to them. You guys go ahead, I'll catch up. Seriously, man, the landlord is going to kick us out if he catches us, Derek said. Please hurry up. The second that you've been thinking about your whole life, my father was saying. He pushed his chair back roughly across the floor and stood to face me. Did you hear that? Preston asked, clearly reacting to the sound of the chair. He's coming. Screw it, let's leave him. If he gets caught, it's his own fault. I'm not going down with him. Is almost here, my father finished. I didn't move. I think I'd forgotten how to. I was in such a state of shock that I didn't know what to do, and all I could think was that if I left now, then I was sure I would never see him again. A few frozen seconds passed together in one big clump of time, and before I could react, I heard the sound of the door closing behind me. The door slammed me to my senses enough for me to turn and look at the place my friends had stood a moment before. I jerked back to face my father once more. He had taken a step closer. My brain makes sense of scaling and distance so naturally that we hardly ever notice it until it stops working. That's the effect I felt when my father had grown several inches in apparent height from the single forward step he'd taken. The effect was replicated with his second step, which brought him towering over me in a way that I hadn't seen since early childhood memories. And as he moved, he seemed to be aging, putting on weight as his skin creased and wrinkled before my eyes. His stature shrinking back toward a more moderate perspective, so much less powerful and sure than he had been a moment before. This process didn't slow as he reached and then passed the age he appeared when I saw him last. Second by excruciating second, I watched him grow old, as he never did in life. He appeared more wise than ever, as the gray blossomed into thick white hair, his eyes sparkling all the more of their piercing insight. All too quickly this too had passed, making way for the shriveling and decrepit decay of old age. He was still moving towards me, only a few paces away, but he trembled every time he lifted his leg to move. One step away, but he never made it any closer. His tremendous leg collapsed suddenly under his own weight, and he pitched forward toward the floor at my feet. I dove to catch him, and together we both tumbled, although I at least managed to cushion his fall. I held him against my chest for several seconds, afraid to pull back and look at his face, for fear of what withered shell of a human being which would remain at the very end of these prophetic years. I felt his fingers clutching feebly against my shirt. Then they stopped. His last breath rattled free, and all the heat fled from his corpse against me, and in that breathless second, I think my own heart must have stopped as well, because never in my life have I felt such a profound stillness, broken only by the probing fingers, which began to stir once more. The fingers weren't soft and warm anymore, rigid and bony, pushing into my chest like I had fallen against sharp rocks, harder and faster with every moment, pawing at me like an animal desperate to dig into the ground. I tried to wrestle free, but the cold form wrapped itself around me. It heaved upward and pushed me into the floor, its rigid legs pinning me painfully, while its hands tore into my chest. I managed to get my arms out from under me, and tried to cross them over my body to shield myself. I might as well have been trying to stop a crowbar with my hands. The force of the flashing bone pummeled through my defenses, and tore my chest open. But I didn't feel any pain. The skin parted as cleanly as the knife through wallpaper had. The skeletal hand inserted a finger into the crack, and slid it down toward my stomach. And my whole torso began to open, in the same clean fashion. I couldn't breathe or call for help, and I was helpless but to lie and watch as the skeleton inserted its second hand to widen the cavity in my body. I willed myself to watch and not look away, to not see that lurking skull above me, whose fixed smile would be blasphemy against my father's gentle smirk. The skeleton kept at its work until it had split me from head to groin, cleanly separating me into two equal halves. I distinctly wondered which half of me was doing the wondering, but that thought quickly gave way to a fixated awareness on the empty darkness which existed in place of blood and bone and internal systems. No, not darkness at all. There was a single light in there too, perhaps a single soul for us both to share, and like a single star in the night sky, it was made all the brighter for the vast emptiness around it. Gently, slowly, with reverence as though stooping at an altar, The skeleton lay down inside of me. Its arms were my arms. Its legs were my legs. Its skull sliding into the black emptiness of my head to fit snugly into place. Then those arms which were not my arms curved around my body, hugging myself and pulling the two halves together to form a single whole. I didn't go in that room again after the wallpaper was put back up. That must have been the first night since he died that I didn't miss him anymore. I don't know how long this process took, maybe 10 minutes or more, but whenever I remember it, I like to think of it all happening in a single second. After that, if that's all it takes to get from heaven to hell, then why shouldn't someone who is whole again make it back just as fast? Up until about 1 year ago, I believed that there was only one supreme power, and that he lived up in the clouds and would claim me when my life finally ended. I believed that this being, if you will, governed all and controlled all. I believed that in his divine world, all would receive justice and punishment through his merit and his alone. I could not have been more wrong. Everyone believes a lie. The Romans, the Greeks, Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, they all have it wrong. There is not only one God. There is not only one supreme being that rules all. They aren't kind and merciful. And they do not live in the clouds but on the earth that was created all those millions of years ago. I'm a worker at a psychiatric facility in New Jersey. I've been working there for around 15 years, and I thought that I had seen my fair share of the crazy people and their illnesses. But then a boy named Benson, who was around 14 years old, came into my care. From a very young age, he was set apart from the other kids. Instead of playing with the other kids, he would sit in a corner and draw on his tablet. For some reason, the family didn't think it necessary to check the notebook for years. Until finally, they did. They flipped through the pages and found pictures of animals in the neighborhood, pets that went missing. That in itself was normal. Who wouldn't want to draw the cute animals that inhabit this world with us? What was terrifying were the rips and the cuts and the bashed-in heads, all in the detail of a professional artist. The kid had a knack for drawing. What got him truly committed, though, was that he drew where he hid the bodies. Sometimes they were buried in the backyard, other times under the porch. One time he even hid one in his closet. How the stench of the decaying carcass of the small house that eluded his mother and father, I don't know and cannot fathom. This all seemed the textbook definition of a child who was a severe psychopath. Someone without feeling or remorse and, in this case, could not socialize with others. As if you were another being trapped in a pen with us. It was as if we were inferior. He would more often than not ignore you, and even if he acknowledged you, he would look through you as if you were invisible, as if you weren't truly there. The only people he responded to were his parents, which is probably the reason it took so long for him to be committed. Around his parents, he played the role of Benson, the teenager, pretty well. He complained about school and passionately talked about the games he was into. Subtract his parents, and he was an entirely different person. He was committed on the 5th of August, and didn't talk to anyone besides asking for a pad and pencil on the first day, until the 2nd of January the next year. This was only because his parents visited late for Christmas because of a freak snowstorm. He again put on his false face, and almost had his parents decommission him. He was extremely manipulative when it came to his parents. When denied the ability to be set free, he was set into a rage, destroying the chair in his room and ripped the mattress off of the bed railing. His parents, considerably upset, began to leave. As they left, I was given the duty of watching over Benson, to make sure that he didn't try to commit suicide or self-harm in any way, after this failed attempt at escape. I watched as he angrily scooped his notepad off the ground, and took his half-shattered pencil and began to forcefully and aggressively scribble on it. About an hour later, I asked to see what he was drawing, and, surprisingly, he handed it over with relish. I was horrified and disgusted. The page showed his parents in a horrific car accident. It looked as if they had slipped on the ice of the road and slammed headfirst into a utility pole. The scene was graphic and in surprising detail for a broken pencil. The father lay spread out over the hood of his car, presumably not wearing a seatbelt, with his head bashed into his shoulders. His brain matter was spread all over the pole. and he had a jagged hole in his shoulder from a fragment of the car. His mother in the passenger seat had the dash crushed against her, and it had split her in half from her left shoulder to the right point of her waist. Her guts were spilled in the interior of the car, and her left eye had a splinter from the windshield that had gone all the way through her head, coming out the back in a clump of brain matter, hair, and blood. I chucked the notepad in the trash bin, but Benson only laughed. I looked at him in disgust, and for the first time he looked at me. He looked me straight in the eyes, and that's when I noticed that they were bright gold. The gold that you only saw in vivid dreams, that you pertain to the Lord and the Savior of this world himself. But beyond the glowing gold of his eyes, there was nothing. That gold was cold and empty, and it held no mercy, no kindness, no remorse. They were deep and endless, and underneath those eyes I saw such power that I trembled. My knees buckled and I fell to the ground. I opened my eyes to Benson standing above me, grinning at me with no happiness in his eyes, only contempt. "You cannot stop it now, Doctor, and you never will," he said in a low monotone voice, a voice that I had never heard used. This was not the voice of Benson, a squeaky teenager. This was the voice of a content God, a man with such power that he had no use for such petty things as possessions or wealth. That is when I realized what that coldness in his eyes was. It was not the eyes of someone who could not feel anything. It was the look of a bloodthirsty monster. No, a supreme being. They swallowed me whole and I lost consciousness. When I awoke, he was gone. The hospital went crazy looking for him for a couple months. They couldn't just let him run away, but I knew they would never catch him. Not if he didn't want them to. It turns out that the parents died in a car crash completely identical to the one the boy had drawn. The mother was cut in half from shoulder to waist by the dash of the car, and a splinter from the windshield had entered her left eye and exited through the back of her skull. The father had been flung out of the windshield due to the fact that he wasn't wearing his seatbelt, and he had crushed his skull into his shoulders when he collided into the utility pole. A jagged shard of the car had been impaled into his shoulder and ripped his heart into shreds. Both died almost instantaneously. Almost. The medics say that the moment before they died, before the father smashed his head in, and before the mother received the shard through her left eye, they experienced the most excruciating pain they had ever felt in their lives. To this day, I don't know why he didn't simply kill me. He had to have known the craze of the supernatural he put in me would drive away my peers and my family, and yet he left me alive. Over the half year I stayed with that hospital, I began to notice that more and more of my mentally ill patients had the same glowing gold eyes. Some contained a shred of sympathy and remorse, while others did not. One could predict exactly when someone was going to die, and another could hear every single voice of every single human on this planet. He could snuff them out like a burnt candle, and could create new ones, as if he were just doodling on a piece of paper. These beings are beyond science, beyond reason, and they cannot be reasoned with. After my termination from the hospital, I began to study these cases of supernatural creatures, for that's what they are. These things are not human, and they need to be terminated, but no one will listen to me. They have locked me up. They call me crazy, but I managed to escape long enough to write this. Please, believe me, I'm not crazy. I'm the only one who knows, and no one will listen. Please, warn others, and whatever you do, do not trust anyone with glowing gold eyes.